Hello class, welcome back to chapter 16, the Renaissance in Europe. So this will be week 4 for you all. So Renaissance is a word that means rebirth. But a rebirth of what exactly? Well, a rebirth of interest in Greek and Roman culture. We get this thing called humanism, pursuing intellectual and scientific inquiry, rediscovering the classical arts. We get scholar humanists. These are people that study things such as grammar, poetry, history, politics, philosophy, and not just Christian teachings. They believed in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Ever heard that one before? Believed that humankind was a perfect creation, and that all things were possible through humans, unlike the medieval philosophy, which was kind of just, you're all terrible and going to hell, etc. Artists were even seen as noble because of their skill, fulfilling their God-given talent. We have a new group of sponsors that show up, rich merchants, and they're going to control a lot of the game, shall we say. We have new and more scientific approaches being bringing us more representational accuracy. How we did this was people were cutting up and dissecting lots and lots of bodies, but we get the nude back in art. We idolize and idealize beauty, for better or worse. We shift from heaven back to earth. Christian subjects are portrayed in human terms. We're interested in the divine, but we're interested in what's here on earth around us. Okay. This period that we're talking about, this is roughly 1400 through 1600. Extreme changes taking place in the world of Western European art. As I mentioned on the previous slide, artists are getting elevated. We get Michelangelo claiming that they're divine, even. And the position of art in society and the influences of patrons and their identities, pretty much the key aspect to Renaissance art here. Um, Again, patrons and the influence of art on society are some of the biggest things that we'll talk about this unit. Now, somewhat of a disclaimer, but it's important to remember we're talking about the Italian Renaissance. We're talking about a European Renaissance. We're not talking about a worldwide Renaissance. So this is important to keep in mind. Some more Renaissance facts. As I mentioned, Renaissance means rebirth, revival of interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture. The scholars that were working in this time, rediscovering everything, these were the humanists. And the humanists believed not just in the teachings of the church, but the supplementing of the teachings of the church with liberal arts. Um, the study of light gives us new artistic inventions and innovations like chiaroscuro, which I hope you read about, linear perspective, which I also hope you read about, but don't worry, we'll talk about it a bit here, as well as atmospheric perspective. The nude was considered very noble. The nude was God's creation, and so we took apart bodies, put them back together, um, just to get a better idea of how things worked and how to portray them. Now we go back to some philosophy here. Plato is rediscovered, and Plato has this idea where he equates beauty with moral goodness, and so that sets us back for quite a while. Some Frankenstein precursors here. We can see how Mary Shelley was thinking the way she did by the time, oh, what, the 1800s rolled around. They would have been very influenced by the Italian Renaissance. And so in art, there's this idea of borrowing features from various bodies to create the ultimate refined body in art. I want to talk about Vitruvius really quick because he's one of the most important rediscoveries of the Renaissance. Vitruvius was a Roman architect, and he had a 10-volume treatise on architecture that was rediscovered. And when we say 10 volumes, we really mean about 10 chapters. It's not a ten book series. Um, Vitruvius specifically wrote about harmonic proportions and beauty. So, without getting too crazy and just sidelining the rest of this lecture, harmonic proportion is the idea that musical notation can be transferred over to architecture. Um, and because musical notation is mathematically correct, they tried to apply the perfection, correctness of music with architecture. So before the Renaissance, it's important to note, only the nobles and clergy could afford to be patrons of the arts. But the Renaissance gives us the merchant class, wealthy, socially ambitious people who are spending on art just for fun. I shouldn't say just for fun, but um, why was the Renaissance happening? Well, Italy was extremely powerful in the Middle Ages due to city-states and banking endeavors such as Venice. Um, Also recall the previous lecture I mentioned, the looting and pillaging of places like Constantinople by European forces happened, and then they would take all of this stuff back to Italy. The rise and influence of the Catholic Church, of course, also played a part in all of this, and the Italians considered themselves inheritors of Rome by living amongst its ruins. And it's kind of difficult for us here in America to consider something like this, living amongst the ruins of our ancestors, right? Like, yes, we've got bombed out, deserted Main Street towns, streets here in Oklahoma, but nothing like what the Italians would have seen just day to day. Um, let's take a look at some art now, shall we? This is a sculpture of David by Donatello, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on this next slide. So we're back to celebrating the nude because uh, David is, of course, nude here. Now, what's important about this sculpture, however, is it's the first full round sculpture made since antiquity. Now, what does that mean for those of you who have read? Yes, full round sculpture means that you can go fully around it. It is fully three-dimensional. Now, this was created for the Medici family, which you will know if you've played Assassin's Creed, but if not, they're a powerful banking family in Florence. They had their own palace, had their hands in politics, military, everything. You would think that that wouldn't represent the underdog, but Florence was much smaller than a big, powerful state such as Milan, and David was representing Florence as being kind of the underdog in Italy at the moment. That did not last long, though. Here's the Medici Palace, current day. Those tiny little smart cars kind of give you an idea of the scale of it all, but what you can see is a mix of different architectural styles. It's clearly classical up at the top, but more medieval towards the bottom. Um, and it was used to basically show off the family's power, their ideas about art, etc. I want to talk about architecture in art in the Renaissance. This is Masaccio's Trinity with the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and donors. And it's just such a great one because we have so many Renaissance characteristics packed into one work of art. First of all, I want us to note the barrel vault ceiling, but also I want us to look at these beautiful Corinthian columns, the level of color used, Um, the squares here are used because squares were considered a sacred geometrical form and so belonged in churches. But the next thing I want us to see here is let's look at the way that these figures are arranged. This can teach you something very special about art that you can use to impress your friends and family. This is called the hierarchy of order, hierarchy of importance, order of importance, whatever you want to call it. Um, but you will see this a lot because of the references to the Holy Trinity or a triangle. So first off, you see the donors who paid to have this painting and paid to get painted into the painting. They're on the very bottom because they're the least important. Um, Next, we have Virgin Mary here and St. John the Evangelist. Notice their halos. They're obviously more important than the donors. They're higher up, but only by one step. Now, Jesus on the cross, he has his halo to symbolize his divinity, but he is also the absolute center of this painting. And if we look at his relation to the Virgin and St. John, it creates a triangle. And if we zoom out, it creates an even bigger triangle trinity with the donors. And if we zoom further out, God up here, um, we know he's God because he's higher up than everybody, creates an even bigger triangle. So you see that they really, really loved their Holy Trinity in Renaissance art. Kind of showing you a reference point for the previous building. We have Leon Battista Alberti's Church of Sant'Andrea. This is in Mantua, Italy. So the interior is structured around geometric shapes of the circle and square. Now, this is slightly based on uh, the Roman pantheon, and as I mentioned, circles and squares, or even circles in squares, as we can see up here, was pretty much as good as it got for um, Italian art and architecture. Um, Botticelli's Primavera, some of you might have seen this before. We'll go to a more uh, zoomed out version so that we can see the whole thing here. But there's lots going on here in Primavera. Um, Artists inevitably turned back to Greek and Roman gods and goddesses for subject matter. Botticelli, he was getting patronage from the Medici, so he could pretty much do anything he wanted. Now, the Medici were very wise because they sponsored one of the world's first art academies, where humanist scholars and artists met to discuss classical culture, its relationship to Christianity, Neoplatonism, all kinds of new philosophy and tricks. So the point of this image is that it's an allegory to spring. The central character is Venus, and we have Cupid even shooting an arrow down at people. Um, Lots of things going on in this. He's shooting an arrow at the three graces. They're supposed to embody female charm. You can see his arrow kind of poking out uh, from the top there. Zephyrus, who is the wind, is snatching up a nymph there on the right. Uh, and we also have another kind of Assassin's Creed-like thing, the golden orb, the golden apple. What could this all mean? Bearer of good fruit, like bearing babies. The apple of knowledge from the Garden of Eden. It could represent lots of things. And one that at least most of you ladies will probably recognize is Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Um, a very interesting thing is going on in this work. We can see good examples of line in this work. Um, Start by looking at Zephyrus, and he's blowing on Venus. He's pushing her. We can see her body contorting back towards the shore based on his gust of breath. Um, But what we can also see is if we're standing directly in front of this, like let's say at a museum, Zephyrus is making a line from this side. This lady's trying to cover her up, is making a line from this side, and then us, the viewer, make a line straight ahead by looking at the painting, thus creating, guess what? A triangle. So lots of clever devices in Renaissance art. So we'll talk a little bit about medieval material culture, or pardon me, Renaissance material culture here. This is called a cassone. The cassone was a bed chest, basically, and it was meant to denote the wealth of the family and the social status overall. Now, here we have a tournament going on, just like if you've watched Game of Thrones, Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger, a tournament. So when two families would get married, or honestly, when pretty much anything would happen of note, they would hold a tournament. We can see the coat of arms of the family carved into the wood of the cassone here. Cassoni were basically bedchamber chests for storing housewares. They were a very typical bridal commission of the time. Now, the Renaissance can be split into two kind of distinct eras. Um, the High Renaissance was a period of just really barely 25 years from 1500 to 1525, in which almost all of the most celebrated works of Western art from the Renaissance were produced, such as those by Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. All of the turtles, right? We get this term Renaissance man as well. Renaissance man, kind of like a jack of all trades, someone who is very well informed about or very good at doing many different unrelated things. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was a Renaissance man because he was a painter, inventor, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, and musician. Speaking of, let's talk about our friend Da Vinci just a little bit. Um, of course, we could do a whole entire class or lecture devoted to just Leonardo. Um, Brilliant humanist of the Renaissance, study of human proportions. To our left here, one of his most well-known works relating a human body with, you guessed it, the square and the circle, the two most important shapes. Leonardo took his notes backwards and with the wrong hand on purpose so that his diaries and notebooks could not be read. And he's also famous for his linear perspective in The Last Supper. Michelangelo, he was a slight rival to our boy Da Vinci. Michelangelo was working and had established a reputation as one of the GOATs by age 25. He received a commission for David, and this is the David that we all know and love. We can see the evolution of the classical style because, yes, it's focused on the body, but due to the musculature, the skeletal features of the body, this is the Renaissance update. Okay, this is the um, product of all of that steadying the body. We can see the tension present in the work. We can see a face that's alive. Um, this one was placed at the square next to Donatello's David. So we can see a theme of David in the Renaissance times of being the underdog. Michelangelo's most famous work, however, is arguably the Sistine Chapel. Commissioned by Pope Julius initially to build his tomb, Michelangelo said, "Bleh, I don't know," um, because he hated painting. So we're still surprised that he ended up with this instead of the tomb. Um, I want to talk briefly about the concept of a cartoon. So we get the word cartoon from individual images. Michelangelo did not just sit on his back and paint all of this freehand. Each and every figure that you see in the Sistine Chapel was developed at the start as an individual figure or a cartoon, which could then be traced onto the ceiling. So, I don't know about you, but when I found this out, it kind of shattered my mind a little bit to know that some of the most famous art of all time is simply just tracing. Here's a bit better view of it. You're allowed to, well, I should say you're not allowed to take pictures in person, but if you go on the internet or if you have VR goggles or something, there's many different ways to view this um, yourself. So, illusionistic architecture is present here. Something else that is kind of freaky to realize is none of the points, the separations, the columns, none of this is real. This is all painting. So, just another example of how great Michelangelo's technique was. New St. Peter's, they were rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica in the Renaissance. Michelangelo was going to be the one who did it, but he ended up not doing it, and that's about all there is to say about that. It's kind of boring. I want to mention the Republic of Venice. They were probably one of the most powerful players in the Renaissance and in the Middle Ages. Um, they had great commerce, stole a bunch of stuff, pillaged a bunch of places. They had spices, luxury goods from Asia, and they were making glass. They had a huge military that could allegedly produce one warship a day. Venice was officially flipped on during this time. Uh, let's talk about a few artists. Here is Titian's Venus of Urbino, and lots of things I wanted to show you in this one. Mostly notice the texture being presented, not just on the curtain behind her, of her hair, and of the bed she's laying on. Depth perception is notable here. We can see a maid in the back, and oh, what is she getting into back there? Well, it's a cassone. The maid is looking probably for some extra sheets or dishes within the cassone. Now, this is a nude painting, right? This is a very sensual painting, and people would have kept stuff like this in their house, and they would cover it up, and they would tell their friends, "Hey, come on, let's gaze at my painting that I have to keep covered up a little bit." Kind of pervy, kind of weird, but um, that's the past. Now, when we talk about the Italian Renaissance, we also have to mention the Northern European Renaissance. Um, Northern Renaissance was more of a gradual transition from medieval times. In fact, when we look at some of this art, it will look much more medieval to you than Renaissance-y. Um, this is a good example. Latrace Richer's prayer book, basically a little devotional book, featured a calendar. We can see that up top. Typical seasonal activity, and so think of this too. This was a mini book, so this is a hugely blown up page. The original was only 9 inches. So when we think about the Northern Renaissance, what do we have to look out for? Well, um, we're talking about the countries of Switzerland, Germany, um, North France, Netherlands, um, and these all just have different characteristics than Italy. I want you to recall that they're more concerned with representing details um, of the world than actual accuracy here. Robert Kempen's Merode altarpiece. I got to travel to the Metropolitan Museum of Art Medieval Cloisters and see this in person in New York City last year. Quite a treat. So this is a panel, an altarpiece. It's supposed to be at a church, right? Linear perspective was catching on, but if you notice, look at the tables in here and the way that this Mary in the middle is sitting down. And they sure tried to get the linear perspective, but they didn't quite have it down just yet. But this is a highly symbolistic uh, work of art. There's lots going on. The candles represent purity. We have crosses strewn throughout, white linen, and what do we have here but a little miniature Jesus shooting in through the window? So I bet this might be the craziest explanation of where babies come from that you've heard in a while, but in order to explain the divine conception of Mary, mother of Jesus, because, the story is she got knocked up divinely, not by her husband. And so not only was it scandalous, but it was just hard to understand as well. And so in Northern Europe, they came up with this idea, and you can see it in this work that, oh, well, a little Jesus sperm must have flown in through the window and into Mary's ear and impregnated her that way, which is definitely a stretch if you ask me. But that's their explanation. Roger Van der Weyden, pardon me, Portrait of a Lady. This is oil paint, and you can definitely tell because look at all these details. And this is where I'm telling you, the northern artists were more concerned with rendering things, not people precisely. We can see her hair being pulled into the braid. We can see that this is see-through and see her skin and features under it, and her hair holder. We can see the details on her belt buckle, which, by the way, her hands are clasped by it to draw attention there. So once again, Northern Renaissance focused on the details. Um, Hans Holbein the Younger's The Ambassadors, another work of art that is big on material culture. So Hans Holbein was a German painter who studied Italian painters, and so he made fusion paintings of German art and Italian art. Um, he was good enough that he got appointed to the court of Henry VIII. Yes, that Henry VIII. Um, the Italian influence is obvious here. We see the patterns and things like that, but the globalistic details here are too big to ignore. We not only have instruments and stuff, but we also have mathematical things. We have globes. This is an Islamic rug that they're standing on, and this skeleton, the skull right here, is not just some bad clip art. It is a reminder that everyone dies eventually, which is a big thing throughout most of history. The Latin phrase memento mori simply means remember that you will die. Peter Bruegel the Elder, um, most famous nowadays for having one of his paintings be the cover of a Fleet Foxes album. He was a 16th century Dutch artist, painted principally landscapes, and we look towards Peter Bruegel the Elder for how bustling a lot of his paintings are and showing us what would have all been going on, in the town around this time. Um, because obviously we don't have cameras, right? There's not very many ways for us to know exactly what people were doing back in the day, as it were. And so we have to rely on artwork by artists such as Peter Bruegel the Elder to see how were people working, how were they reclining, how were they relaxing, how were they partying. Another artist critically important is Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer was an engraver, and he attempted to fuse Northern and Italian Renaissance ideas. He visited Italy twice, and he himself wrote a little treatise on art In fact, he wrote two, the Treatise on Movement and four books on human proportions. He was not a fan of the Northern Renaissance, surprisingly enough. And he was also one of the first artists to sign his work. Um, Before this, you either just knew, oh, that's a Da Vinci or something, or the artist was very, very minimized. They were just doing public works. They were painting for rich people. But now, with the rise of the merchant class, individual artists start to become the in thing. Matthias Grunwald and the Eisenheim altarpiece. So many things to say about this one. Um, if we notice, Christ is looking a little bit like a leper here. That's because this was originally located in a skin affliction hospital. Um, Northern art was much more harsh than uh, Italian Renaissance art in this way. And I just want you to look at some of the crazy symbolism that we've got here. We have John the Baptist over here pointing at Christ, kind of saying, "You're next, buddy." We have the Lamb of God down here, its blood dripping into a chalice, the Holy Grail. Um, we see Mary, mother of Jesus, here in white because she's pure, and it's also making her out to look like a nun because, once again, this was located in a hospital. And we have Mary, mother of Jesus, or pardon me, Mary Magdalene down here with red-ish robes, pinkish robes to denote passion, um, looking up at Christ. And once again, we can get bam, 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 some Holy Trinities in here as well. So excellent, excellent image for symbolism. Let's talk really, really quickly about mannerism. Mannerism was a funky and weird style that kind of just appeared towards the end of the Renaissance. Mannerism was a decadent reaction against the order and balance of the Renaissance. Um, Mostly, so it's basically just a revolt. It's people being silly to be silly. And so what were they doing? Well, they're doing stuff like this. This is Agnolo Bronzino's allegory, and we don't really know what the hell's happening in this painting. Um, Pretty much every art historian and scholar has said this is too weird to diagnose. Um, there's a forbidden and weird erotic undercurrent with these small cupids and naked woman. This does not appear to be a mother-son typical relationship here, and I want you to pay attention to how long the bodies are. Mannerism had lots of elongated bodies, and it was just a weird time. We'll close with Miss Sofonisba Anguissola, self-portrait at the easel. Sofonisba was one of the first women artists to achieve celebrity among her contemporaries, and boy did she have to fight for it, eldest of six sisters and one brother, but by age 22 she was already friends with Michelangelo himself. And this is a pretty enormous flex because it's a painting within a painting. And even within this painting, we can see the painting on the easel has those mannerist kind of long bodies. Sofonisba herself is gazing at us, making us just a little bit uncomfortable. But we'll close with Sofonisba and end our foray into the Italian Renaissance. Make sure to watch the Rick Steves video and fill out the worksheet on that. Rick Steves is hilarious and an excellent travel guide, and I'll see you all next time.